In his letter to the Romans, Paul writes, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse." Paul is making an appeal that God has revealed Himself through His creation. Notice the attributes that God reveals through His general revelation. He reveals His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature. He does so in such a way that the invisible is clearly perceived. What is the conduit through which God reveals? His creation. This lesson will address two primary arguments for the existence of God. In other words, in this lesson you will be exposed to a method of looking at God's creation and perceiving His invisible attributes. The two arguments that we will use are as follows: the cosmological argument and the moral argument. First, the cosmological argument. This argument attempts to demonstrate God's existence by contemplating the beginnings of the universe. Perhaps it would be more beneficial to outline the problem. Those who do not believe that God exists, or atheists, believe that the universe is all there ever was, is, or will be. In other words, atheists argue that the universe has always existed. In general, most atheists also believe that the universe is entirely material. This view is referred to as materialism. If materialism is correct, then God cannot exist, since God is immaterial. The cosmological argument, or the argument from the beginning of the universe or cosmos, argues that the universe cannot be eternal and must have had a beginning. The cosmological argument is typically outlined using the following argument. Premise 1, everything that began to exist was caused by something outside of itself. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. And the conclusion, therefore, the universe was caused by something outside of itself. In order for this argument to be compelling, the first two premises must be more likely than their contradictory or opposite. So let's take a look at the first premise. The first premise is rather axiomatic. It is impossible for something that begins to exist to be caused by itself, since it would have to exist in order to create itself. Now it's the second premise that is the controversial premise. How do we know that the universe began to exist? Well, let's examine one of the many lines of evidence. Let's consider a philosophical line of evidence. If the universe were infinite, there would be an infinite collection of days in history. If this were the case, we would never arrive at today. Let me illustrate this point. Suppose that you have an infinite line of dominoes that represent days in history. In order for today's domino to be knocked down, yesterday's domino must fall. However, in order for yesterday's domino to fall, the day before yesterday's domino must fall, and so on and so forth. However, if this causal relationship is infinite, today's domino would never fall. And yet, here we are at today's domino, if you will. Therefore, history must have had a beginning. Now, while this argument requires the universe to have a beginning, one must infer certain attributes of its cause. First, the cause must be something other than an infinite regress of event causation, for this would lead to the same absurdity associated with an infinite history. If the universe was not caused by some prior event, then perhaps it is more likely to have been caused by some prior agent. The universe is comprised of time, space, and matter. However, if the universe began to exist, its cause must be outside of time, non-spatial, and immaterial. Let's take a look at the second argument for God's existence, the moral argument. The moral argument attempts to demonstrate God's existence by contemplating the existence of objective moral values and duties. When we say objective moral values and duties, we are simply referring to those things that are morally right or wrong regardless of one's opinion. For example, torturing babies for fun. While the prospect of this action is certainly grotesque, it is often used as an example of something that is objectively immoral. In other words, we would say one's opinion regarding torturing babies for fun is irrelevant to the moral nature of this act. So, the moral argument is often outlined as follows. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Once again, in order for this argument to be compelling, the truth of the first two premises must be more likely than their contradictory or opposite. So let's take a look at the first premise. The first premise asserts that the existence of objective moral values and duties is contingent upon God's existence. In other words, the only worldview that is adequate to explain the existence of objective moral duties is a world with an objective grounding for morality. An atheistic worldview does not properly ground objective morality. On the contrary, an atheistic worldview promotes the idea that the strongest survive, that might makes right, and the notion that one must do whatever one can to pass one's genes on into the next generation, even if it means torturing a baby for fun. While the atheist will certainly deny that there's some circumstance where torturing a baby for fun is permissible, the point here is that the atheist cannot objectively ground the immorality or the immoral nature of this act. The atheist must borrow from a theistic worldview in order to do so. How about the second premise? Do objective moral values and duties exist? Why can't morality be subjective or a matter of mere opinion? In his famous book, Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis provides the following argument. He writes, "But the most remarkable thing is this. Whenever you find a man who says he does not believe in a real right and wrong, you will find the same man going back on this a moment later. He may break his promise to you, but if you try breaking one to him, he will be complaining, 'It's not fair,' before you can say Jack Robinson. A nation may say treaties do not matter, but then the next minute they spoil their case by saying that the particular treaty they want to break was an unfair one. But if treaties do not matter, and if there is no such thing as right and wrong, in other words, if there is no law of nature, what is the difference between a fair treaty and an unfair one? Have they not let the cat out of the bag and shown that whatever they say, they really know the law of nature, just like anyone else?" In the second chapter of Romans, the Apostle Paul addresses the same issue, but from a different angle. He writes, "They, the Gentiles, show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them." The point is this: objective morality exists, and it's undeniable. We could point to the example of murder or rape or torturing babies for fun and conclude that the moral nature of these acts is attached to the object rather than the subject. In other words, where the object goes, the moral nature goes. Wherever torturing babies for fun is found, it is always wrong. From these two arguments, we've discovered that the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, eternal, immaterial, atemporal, non-spatial, personal, and morally perfect being is the best explanation for the existence of the universe and objective moral values. If it is the case that God's invisible attributes are clearly perceived through His creation, then why are there atheists? Paul prefaces these comments by noting that the unrighteous suppress the truth. One might ask, why doesn't God make Himself more evident? Why doesn't God provide an unmistakable sign? We believe that He has. And the next lesson, entitled, "For the Bible Tells Me So," is dedicated to making that case. Thank you for joining me for this lesson. If you have any questions regarding the content covered here, please visit our website for more information on how to enroll in courses that cover this topic in more detail. May God bless you as you get ready to engage.